Well, we thought that it was, in the current situation on the COVID-19 and the war in Europe, it was a good moment to look at the past for answers for our uncertain future. And we thought that famines were essential in this aspect because they're linked to the war and they're linked to the mankind from the beginning of times. So knowing that in the recent years there have been many advances and contributions to the knowledge of our travel past in the area of famines, we thought that it was a great idea to gather some of the most important and leading scholars on European famines to talk about our last 2 centuries famines. So the goals, the objectives of our conference, it was to foster comparative perspectives among famines, to delve into various topics related to famine, and of course to try to open up new pathways to explore our travel past. So we were, and I think that the program reflects this, we are interested in the causes, in the development, the consequences of the famines, and also the memories, the official, the individual, the social memories of famines, and of course their transmission, representation, and commemoration. So we know that history is a fruit of power, and the way we remember, the way we explain famines are a good example of all this, and a good opportunity to build a better future and to face the present day famines, the present day challenges. So for this, we open up a call for papers for everyone who wanted to come, and we're really happy because we got a great response and great contributions that we're going to enjoy in the following 3 days. And we're really happy also because we have here Professor Cormac of Gráda, that is Professor Emeritus of Economics in University College at University College Dublin, and is a leading expert in the history of famines. I prepare a longer presentation, but he asked me that please to short it up. So I'm gonna skip that. He's been member of many academic societies, president of the Economic History Association. He's been member of many editorial boards, visiting professor in many important universities. For example, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University, and he has many articles and books published. Over 100 articles on famines from medieval age up to the situation today. So I'm going to just mention some of his books. His work, for me and for the group of Granada, has been really inspiring. And I'm going to focus in at least 5 publications, 5 books. First of all, books related with the Irish famine, Ireland, A New Economic History, 1780, 1939, a further analysis, and also a great view of the history of Ireland before the famine and after the famine, and that contains a further analysis on the 90s economic boom. Also, a very important book to understand the Irish famine, Black 47 and Beyond: The Great Irish Famine in History, Economy, and Memory, published in Princeton University Press. That, from a point of view, is a great insight about Irish famine, and basically studies the Irish famine deeply. A famine that a study, the study of the Irish famine that led to the study of famines elsewhere. But he's been worried also in other famines, in world famines, and a good example of all that is a deeply influential book, Famine: A Short History, published in 2006. That it's, from a point of view, a revealing work that clarifies that it's something really important, what famines are, the perception, the memories, and that it has been very, very useful for many, many scholars. I think that talking from the Spanish editor point of view, it will be necessary to publish his work in Spanish. I know that it has been published in Italian, isn't it? Yeah. So if Italians have it, why we shouldn't? So also an important collective books that, from a point of view, is the first systematic study on famines in all parts of Europe, from the Middle Ages up to date. It's the book edited with Guido Alfani, Famine in European History, with chapters of some scholars like Stephen Whitcroft, that is here, and it's that contains even a chapter on the famine in Spain by our leading colleague Vicente Pérez Moreda. Talks about medieval famines. And finally, published in 2020, Eating People is Wrong, and other essays on famine, its past and its future. That it's an important contribution that makes reflections about understanding in another way important famines like the Great Bengal Famine or the Chinese famine. But it's also a book that one of the great things that it has is that it's a warning for the future. I think that Professor Gráda's work is a compromise. Oh, thank you very much. Muchas gracias. His work is compromised with understanding the past, and it offers us a way to deal with the problems of the present and the future. For a better future and for a better understanding of famines. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you very much, Professor Gráda, for being here. We're really glad. Welcome to the University of Granada. Thank you for accepting our invitations.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the introduction. Looking out, I have figured that I'm the granddad of the meeting by a short head, I must say. Stephen is only a little bit younger. But please don't call me granddad. It's this talk is based in large part on a few chapters in a book that I've done, but don't have a publisher for yet. It was my COVID project. So it's a book about the civilian victims of the two world wars. And that began actually as a conference presentation on the famines of the two world wars. But the conference was cancelled because of COVID. And then I was all dressed up with nowhere to go, as it were. So I decided to make a book and to talk about civilian victims in general. Let me start off by talking a little bit about a publication most of you will be familiar with. This is Stephen Devereux's paper. It's a widely circulated working paper which is available online, but I don't think it's ever been, strictly speaking, published. So I'm starting with this paper here by Devereux, which was published in the early part of the millennium, about 2005, on the famines of the 20th century. And Devereux lists all the famines and comes to a total of, I think it's 75 million famine deaths over the 20th century. And that was a bit of a shocker, I think, when the paper was published. Of those famines, one accounts for over 40% of the total. That's the Great Leap famine in China. And then two famines in the USSR account for another 20 to 23%. Now, these are approximate percentages. But what I'd want to say about Devereux's paper is that his total is almost certainly too low. And that is even though some of his estimates are too high. I mean, he has an estimate of several million for Henan in 1942-43, and that's been written down. He also has a figure of 3 million for famine in North Korea in the 1990s. but that is certainly far too high. Experts now say that there may have been 5,600,000. So despite some exaggerations, his number, I would argue, is a good deal too low. And this is one way of showing a different view. So you have the cumulative total here. And let me see. Yeah, that's so. Starting off, yeah, that's better. So you can see the total here on the right-hand side. It comes to something like 90 million or so, 85 to 90 million. And so you'll see that there are steps. There are three fairly big steps. There's one here, that's World War I. Then there's World War II, and then there's the Great Leap, famine. And you'll see that since the Great Leap, actually, there isn't that much going on. You also see that there is a change in the regional composition globally, so that in more recent decades, you'll see that there's a concentration of famines in Africa in particular. And then there are a few in Asia. The big green rectangle on the right-hand side there at the bottom, that's North Korea, you know. But that is the story. Now, another way of showing what's going on is this. So this table had to be divided in two because there were so many famines. So this is up to the end of World War II. Location, and then these are Devereux's estimates, and these are mine, alternative estimates. And I'm highlighting here in yellow famines that were associated with war. And you see that war is extremely important for famine in the 20th century. So my cliche is in the 20th century, with some exceptions, some major exceptions, like in the Soviet Union and in China, Mars, in a way, replaces Malthus. And you won't be able to, let's see, and then here again you have 70 to 80 million versus 80 to 90 million. If anybody wants the details afterwards, I can send them the presentations. Or I can send them the chapters of the book. So, so war is very important in the 20th century. Miguel mentioned the book I put together with Guido Alfani, and we counted the famines there, and something like a third of the famines in that book are, if you like, war famines. So, you know, war is less important than it is in the 20th century. Now, this is kind of basic stuff. Wars make famine more likely, and they also make them worse because they divert labor and capital away from consumption, because they restrict flows of information, of people, of commodities. All these things tend to intensify the risk of famine or make famine worse when they happen. And then there is, of course, the brutal side of war: occupation, destruction, and exploitation. And this becomes worse in the 20th century. This is being called the era of total war. The expression total war, there are examples of its use before 1914, but it really takes off at that time. And what you're talking about, wars which involve mobilization of an unprecedented kind. Wars in which, in some sense, the distinction between combatants and non-combatants are blurred somewhat. And like 2 points here, World War II famines killed more than famines of World War I, but the size of the gap depends on whether you include the Soviet Union after 1918 or not. I think you should. I think Stephen would agree with me on that. We've written jointly about it. a bit. But and you know, this I suppose explains this issue about mobilization. If you go back, the US Civil War comes close in some sense in terms of percentage of GDP spent on waging the war while the war is going on. So, you know, this is a war that lasts 5 years or so, and at the end it costs something like 84% of US GDP. World War I costs less. This is adding together all the countries involved, what they spent, and then grossing up. So, and World War II is in it's in a different ballpark altogether. It's like.
So can I just ask, is that 84% of total GDP?
Yes, yes, yes.
So for each year, it's
yes,
a year.
Yes.
So you'd be better off actually giving the annual.
Well, but the wars last. Some don't last as long as others.
Yeah.
You know, so you want to take that into. Well, this gives you, to some extent, the intensity, because this is these are annual data here. So this here is, if you like, adding together what's here.
So it's 84% of an annual GDP. Well, 64%, 84% of the total GDP of all the years of the war.
Yeah, that's right. So you're trying to calculate the aggregate cost of the war in GDP terms. That's what this refers to. This here refers to spending in a particular year. And you see that this is comparing the US and the UK. In the UK, it goes up to 40% during World War I. And in both countries, it reaches 40% or more during World War II. In the US, I mean, World War I is not a big deal. And then this here gives you Germany and Japan during World War II. Japan doesn't count during World War I. This here is the Russo-Japanese War. And then the data are probably a bit dodgy. During World War II, they tell you that at some point or other, the Germans are spending 100% of GDP on the war. Now, that is physically possible. You can exploit countries and spend their money, you know. But you also have to say maybe there's something about the numbers that give you this outcome. Okay, so this then is famine deaths during the two wars. And I want to emphasize that in many cases, the numbers are approximations. The numbers are controversial. And in some cases, you will get, you know, thrown out of the country or thrown out of the pub for mentioning a number that is too low. And you'll be accused of being a famine denier and what have you. On the other hand, there is a tendency to exaggerate. So what I try to do here is to be fair-minded and careful and to emphasize the fragility of the data. Having said that, I come up for World War I with a total of about 13 million, most of which is in the Soviet Union, what would become and was the Soviet Union. And then during World War II, you're talking about 17 to 19 million. So you see here for Java, official data lacking. Vietnam estimates range from, and so on. Soviet Union, this is Stephen, depending on what is assumed to be normal mortality. So, and these estimates are being improved over time. But, so the numbers are huge. Talking about something like 30 million between the two world wars. Absolutely huge. And there is another aspect to these numbers which differentiates the famines I'm talking about from historical famines. So this is the situation in World War I. These are some of the countries that were involved. And this is GDP per head using Madison's data. And you see that Germany is ranked 12th in the world at that time. And still it suffers from famine. So you have rich countries in wartime vulnerable to famine. Countries that would not normally suffer from famine. So Madison's database contains GDP per head estimates only for 43 countries. And so Germany and Austria come 12th, 14th, Italy 17th. And Russia is poorer. And then when you look at World War II, that's what we have here. And this again is, GDP, and I think these are 2010 or 2011 dollars. The Netherlands is ranked at that time 7th in the world, and nevertheless, it suffers from a famine. France is 11th. Now, when I say famine, we'll come across to some extent what that means. In France, this is not a biblical famine, but there is excess mortality, considerable excess mortality from undernutrition, and that's why I include France here. Austria, Greece, and so on. And then you're down to India and Indonesia, and they are towards the bottom. They're very poor, they're at the margin. Poland, Vietnam, and China, they suffered severe famines, but there are no GDP per head data for them yet anyway, that I've come across. So, first of all, let me talk about something that I've been interested in since working on the Irish famine. What do people die of during famines? And of course the answer is that in traditional famines, most people don't die of literal starvation. They die of diseases that are associated with their immune systems being compromised, with eating the wrong kinds of food, and so on. Typhus is a big deal during historical famines. During World War I, it still matters. It matters particularly in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And this is a statement from an English observer in Rostock in 1919, and he explains how the conditions there gave rise to a severe typhus epidemic. Crowds of people, no clean water, no hot water, people don't change their clothes, people are crowded together. So these are the kind of conditions that create typhus. And then you have, by contrast with that, so this is still like traces of historical famines. You have what I call modern famines. It's maybe not the best way of describing them, but I'm talking here about Leningrad during the blockade, Greece in 41, 43, the Netherlands in 44, 45, and then in the Jewish ghettos before they're obliterated in Eastern Europe. And there is mortality in all these cases, but the deaths tend to be of literal starvation or of something very, very close to it. So there is this term which was coined in Leningrad first, but then I think it has a wider currency in the Soviet Union, dystrofiki, which means people who are dying of dystrophy. And that is of, literal starvation. So, let's see. Oh, we're having trouble?
No, I think that it's working.
Risk so far.
Am I speaking too loud? No? Okay, all right. Okay. So these are just some little cameos. This is from the ghetto in Vilno, which this is a report that the children, in fact, suffered less from infestation with lice and nits, the kind of thing that would give rise to typhus, than Vilna school children before the war. This is in the ghetto. Now, those children died, they're all murdered later, but or some die, but and those who don't are murdered, and they die of starvation, not of typhus. And then this is Naples, and this time, this is not through medical breakthroughs. This is through the use of DDT by British and mainly American troops. And this is from the Royal Army Medical Corps. An official says that what happened in Naples will doubtless stand out as a milestone in the field of public health and disease control. And the same thing happens when the death camps and the prisoner of war camps are liberated. You get British and American troops using DDT on a whole and that's what's going on here. The photograph isn't very good, but this is Bergen-Belsen in April 1945. And then this here is Leningrad in the spring of 1942, when the authorities are very worried that the end of winter will give rise to disease. So they have the whole population conscripted to clean up the city and just to brush it, to get rid of the snow and so on, so that people don't die of infectious disease. And they're successful. That works. People die of dysentery, but they don't die of typhus. Now, this is another disease which is hunger-related. As you can see here, there are increases in lots of places during World War I. I don't know how well you can see, but this is the situation in Belgium, Germany, and Austria, England and Wales, Ireland, USA. So there's really not much going on there, which is what you would expect. And then these are cities, these here. So you've got Berlin, Budapest, Prague, and Vienna. And here you have Krakow, Lviv, and Warsaw. And you can see the situation here is very dramatic. And here finally you have the Entente powers. Was it? I'm having trouble reading. It's Paris, Rome, and somewhere else. There isn't much, but you can see that there is a huge increase, in particular, in deaths from tuberculosis in places like Warsaw. And then you can contrast that with World War II. Where death rates still rise, but from lower bases. So there's been a lot of improvement in the interwar period. I'm just giving Warsaw here as a point of comparison. So you get an increase during World War II from 150 to 500 per 100,000 between the beginning of the war in 1944. But that compares from, pretty much the numbers are double during World War I. So there is a kind of I suppose you could call it an epidemiological transition in that period, which helps. And then you get huge increases in Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest as well in 1945, at the tail end of the war. And also, there is research to show that TB is a very serious problem in the death camps and in POW camps. And recently I came across this claim that 2 in 5 of the autopsies carried out in Dachau after liberation found evidence of advanced TB. Okay, so this is another, we're in the realm here of famine demography, and this is another aspect that gets talked about a lot, the gender aspect. And these data here refer to from a work by Violette Hionidou on the islands of Syros and Chios and in Athens Piraeus. And you see that there is a huge male disadvantage. Men are, you can see here in the age group, say 20 to 40, males are twice as likely to succumb as females. And then this is a situation in Bengal, which is a very, very, very different, poor country. There's still a female advantage, but it's much smaller. And finally, this is Leningrad. And this is just to show that you have to be careful with the data, because you see here that the male to female ratio is very low for ages over 15 or 20, and that's why, because they're all off fighting. They're not in Leningrad. Leningrad is a city of women during the blockade. That's an exaggeration, but it's, as a friend of mine used to say, it's an honest exaggeration. It's a useful exaggeration. Now, just to give you a sense too of this, I suppose the way in which the war impacted on agriculture, I'm confining this to data on wheat and potatoes. and comparing World War I and World War II. And if you compare in Britain, first of all, Britain doesn't suffer any reduction in output during World War I. And that would explain why, there is work associated in particular with Jay Winter that the war was good for civilians in Britain. In fact, that children in particular and the poor were better looked after. But then when you contrast that with World War II, there is far more effective mobilization in agriculture. And that is partly because there is a very draconian compulsory tillage regime. Farmers who simply allow their cows eat grass, they're said, no, you've got to grow wheat and potatoes and so on, and that's why you get this big increase. But then if you compare that to Germany, Germany during World War I, the situation is very bad. During World War II, less so. But nevertheless, there is a decline. And of course, the reason, we'll talk about that in a minute, the reason why Germany doesn't succumb to severe hunger during World War II is that it exploits those areas to its east and its west, which it has occupied. The Soviet Union, the situation is, I should allow Stephen maybe later to elaborate on these data, but the situation is not great. One saving grace in the Soviet Union is an increased reliance on potatoes, and that was a help. And here you have, you can see the potatoes go way up here, and then this is Italy here. So I mentioned potatoes, I suppose, because I'm Irish, and we know the disaster associated with the failure of the potato in Ireland. But here you have, during World War I and World War II, to some extent, the potato saving the day. Now, I think one can exaggerate that in the German context. This is from a propaganda postcard issued in 1915, but the potato crop failed badly in 1916, and you have the so-called turnip winter that follows as a result. In 1918 and 1919, the situation probably would have been worse in Germany. There would have been more deaths except for the potato. And then this is a picture of kids and a garden plot. I think this is in Leningrad in 1942 or 43. So I should mention too that the world wars are associated with a new form of famine relief. It's pretty much unprecedented. This is rationing. In fact, the first use of the word rationing by economists, which comes during World War I, it's always with inverted commas, as if we're using this word in a way that's unfamiliar. But rationing is widespread as a form of famine relief. The earliest use of the term in the Oxford English Dictionary is in 1914. And I think in the Irish Times, which is easy to search if you're in Ireland, I think it's 1915. You know, we find it hard to imagine that that word is new, but at that stage it was. That is not to say that rationing was completely unprecedented in history. There was rationing, not very successful, during the Commune in Paris in 1871. There was rationing in, I'm escaping now the name of the town in India during the Sepoy mutiny. Probably, yes, look now, yeah. Now the thing about rationing is that it entails both price controls and shifting entitlements. It entails, you've got to have a lot of leverage over both supply and demand. That is a requisite for rationing work. Now, this here is using a little bit of economics. There's a classic paper by Martin Weitzman, which shows that the more uniform the need for the ration commodity, the more homogeneous the commodity is, and the more unequal income distribution, then the better rationing works. So these are kind of good conditions to impose rationing. For rationing to work, it has to be perceived as fair. Everybody has to see this, there's no corruption going on here. My neighbour isn't getting twice as much as I am. And then everybody is prepared to suffer if they feel their neighbours are forced to suffer as well. Now, fair does not mean equal. Fair is on the understanding that people who are doing hard physical work, like miners, for example, or indeed soldiers, get more in their rations than civilians, and also that kids get less than adults and so on. So countries devise ways of coming up with ration entitlements which are considered fair. Now, there is rationing during World War I, but it's really during World War II that it's almost universal. So you get, these kind of photographs. In Germany, people used to refer to faire la polonaise because there was a waltz at the time, and you're kind of, so these queues that wend their way for hundreds of meters. I suppose one could be facetious here and say that the English queue, everybody's laughing because they're queuing for sugar or meat, whereas the Germans here are queuing for much more basic staples. A quick summary, like in France, rationing doesn't really work because there is rampant corruption, and many books have been written about this. The farmers are on the make. There's a criminal underworld that's on the make, and it simply doesn't work. And the state is actually quite weak. In Italy, again, it's hopeless. Rationing is introduced by the fascists at the very outbreak of war, but they have no control over output. Now, of course, it's very difficult to control output when you have hundreds of thousands or millions of producers. And they can all hide and they can sell privately to hungry civilians at higher prices. It's very, very difficult. And that means that in Italy, the black market is important from the beginning and it dominates towards the end. Japan, by contrast, has a system which works well up to 1944. And then hunger sets in. And by 1945, the black market had become the economy itself. In the USSR, there's rationing, private plots, as you saw in that picture from Leningrad, and there's also a black market. So this is the situation in Germany during World War I. You'll see that the allocation of potatoes goes up, but the allocation of everything else has to go down. During World War II, this is from a book by Filzer and Goldman. That should be 2015. And this gives, the scale, if you like, depending on whether you're doing heavy labor, very heavy labor, whether you're a child or not. And then this explains, in a way, why Germany did not suffer so much during World War II. These are deliveries of food from France and the USSR in, I guess, I switched them to millions of kcals. And what they tell you is that a daily intake of 2,000 calories per adult equivalent, this year would have been enough for something like 50 million for a year, or 12.5 million between mid-41 and mid-45. So the food that's brought in from outside plays a massive role in Germany during World War II. And of course, one of Hitler's obsessions was that Germany lose the war because of hunger. And so they use absolutely drastic exploitation against areas that have been colonized. Now, I want to talk next about an aspect of the world wars, and you might say, well, this is not famine, but I would argue that it is. It just takes place in a new environment, and this is deaths in mental hospitals and psychiatric institutions during the two world wars. Now, in Britain during World War I, and this is something that had been lost sight of, death rates in institutions from these telltale diseases, dysentery, typhoid, and TB, rose dramatically during World War I. There is a study by one scholar, and then there is a recent book which covers the whole of England. And factors like overcrowding, inexperienced staff, inadequate food, these are blamed. But the really telling point is when you look at the food intake of the medical and the administrative staff and the patients, it's like 2 to 1. And there is a recent estimate of 17,000 excess deaths in Britain during World War I in psychiatric institutions. Now, you have to be careful with that number because most of the deaths occur in 1918, 1919, so you have to factor out flu deaths. But it's still an issue. And moving on to World War II then, you have in France a situation which is more extreme. And this was first highlighted in a thesis by a medical researcher called Lafont, in a thesis which was published as L'extermination douce in 1987, and that means kind of gentle extermination. And Lafont argued that 45,000 people died in mental institutions from starvation during World War II. And this gave rise to a big controversy in France. Who was to blame for this? The death rate peaked in 1941. Now, there are some interesting aspects. Again, if you look behind those numbers, religious and privately run institutions did better than state institutions. Men suffered more than women. Mortality peaked in 1941. Another interesting fact is that inmates who were regularly visited by family members were much more likely to survive. Now, we don't know whether that was because people brought them food or just because it gave them more hope, but it comes across. Now, Lafont ascribes the deaths to cowardice and to a lack of care, just a lack of empathy for patients on the part of hospital personnel. But others have said, no, this is due to the Vichy eugenicist ideology. I think most people will not accept that, or by a deliberate Nazi-inspired policy of extermination. But you can see why this is one issue that still rankles and is still being discussed a lot in France. In the debate, there are references to la génocide des fous, or the genocide of the mad. While others stress, and this is maybe a more apologetic interpretation, dismal conditions in the mental hospitals even before the occupation, and then the savage budgetary constraints under which they operated during it. But the whole issue of who is still one that is controversial in France. I mean, the number is not in dispute. And then you get Germany, and of course Germany is associated with eugenicist policies against psychiatric patients. And there is, at the beginning of the war, a concerted campaign to kill these people, to murder them. And this is carried out on a large scale in both Großdeutschland and also in Poland. And most of these people die by shooting and gassing. And what ends it in Germany is complaints by a Catholic bishop, the Bishop of Münster. He just went and he said, this is intolerable, and the Nazis stopped the campaign. It's one of the few times where they made some kind of concession to that kind of protest. So in that early period, the campaign had this name Aktion T4, and T4 is it's named after the street number 4. I think it's Tiergassenstrasse or something like that. So that's where T4 comes from. But then once they stopped killing people by gassing and shooting them, they simply allowed them to die of starvation. And it's reckoned that something like 90,000 inmates died of malnutrition after the suspension of T4. So I would see these as famine victims. These are not. And something similar then happens, of course, in other parts of occupied Europe. Again, blockades are important during the wars. And I'll mention Germany and Austria, Mount Lebanon in 1915-16, Leningrad, obviously. Greece is due to an Allied blockade at the beginning. And you could say that the Netherlands is, in a way, due to a kind of a Nazi-imposed blockade in response to the strike that the rail workers organised. And they were under some pressure from the government in exile in London at that time. Again, there's a controversy about whether that strike should have lasted, whether it should have occurred or not. And then in Greece, I just very briefly, I don't want to dwell on this for too long. The death rate from famine was higher in Greece than anywhere else in Europe, except in the Soviet Union. The data are not good. Violetta Yenidou says that there is really no estimate that everybody would agree on, but I use 300,000. And then the context is exploitation, the blockade, hyperinflation. And then this here gives you a sense of what's happening to agriculture. We won't spend time on it. And again, these are data in a book, a very useful book, brought out by the Red Cross in the wake of the war. And it gives you a sense of what's happening to entitlements at the height of the crisis, which is in this period here, December 41 to March 42. I mean, it's still bad into 43. That is the period of the famine. And you see here that you know you're down to starvation level availability. Now, I also want to talk just briefly about an aspect of these famines, which is, I suppose, known but not discussed very much, and that is famine cannibalism. There are no numbers, obviously, or the numbers would be small, but this is something that is not unique to any place. There is evidence of cannibalism on Mount Lebanon. This is part of what present-day Lebanon, and in the Soviet Union in 1921-22. I mean, the Bolsheviks were completely open about this, but they blamed capitalism for the cannibalism, and they publicized, tried to get people to help the Soviet Union by releasing very graphic images of famine cannibalism. And that
it's then in 32, 33, and 36, 47.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then in Leningrad, there are lots of cases, and several hundred people are shot for cannibalism. And I mean, you got a lot of this too. There's a new book out. I was talking to Stephen about it yesterday by Alexis Perry, which is based on diaries kept during the siege. And like to some extent, you have to be careful with these diaries because the authorities encourage people to keep diaries so that their heroism would be recorded. And there's always a suspicion that they will write things fearful that the authorities would see the diaries. But then some of them are searingly honest as far as one can make out, and what comes across is not heroism, but despair and jealousy and cruelty and so on. And you get several references in these diaries to a fear of cannibalism. And there is one case of a 7-year-old boy who had been lured away by a strange woman by the promise of bread, sweets, and other treats as he waited for his aunt outside a bakery. She must have had a ration entitlement in the bakery. And the kid was rescued just in time by police, who arrested the stranger, and once they established her motive, shot her on the spot. The authorities in Leningrad created a special investigative unit consisting of detectives and, interestingly, psychiatrists at the height of the famine. And also in meting out punishment, the authorities distinguished between those who sought to survive on the remains of people who had predeceased them and those who murdered for human food. So the former might have been imprisoned or let go, whereas, as that little anecdote suggests, the latter were for the most part summarily shot. There's also cannibalism in New Guinea and in the Philippines towards the very end of World War II by Japanese troops, and maybe in some cases after the war. They didn't realize the war was over in very remote places. And several of the perpetrators were found guilty later by post-war tribunals and executed. And then you also have evidence of cannibalism in some of the death camps and the POW camps in Germany and elsewhere. So Bergen-Belsen, as we've seen, was liberated by British troops in April 1945. The only British survivor described how towards the end, and I quote, "jungle law reigned even among the prisoners. At night you killed or were killed. By day cannibalism was rampant." Prison doctors told of fleshless bodies with the liver, kidneys and heart knifed out. And an Irish chaplain serving with British troops who helped liberate Bergen-Belsen wrote in his diary, "Many of the bodies showed signs of cannibalism with their livers removed." So these are all different independent descriptions of what was happening. And there's also evidence from survivors of cannibalism in Mauthausen, which is in Upper Austria, in Kaufering, which was a sub-camp of Dachau, in Nordhausen, a sub-camp of Dora Mittelbau in eastern Germany, in Thuringia, and in Camp Pechora in Romania and elsewhere. Needless to say, we have no estimates. But these are also, in a way, famine victims. They're new form, a different kind. But so let me just quickly go over a few case studies on which there has been recent work. Vietnam and Java. The guilty part here is Greg Huff, who wrote a great paper in the Economic History Review a few years ago on Vietnam, and more recently has published a book on Indonesia, Vietnam, and some other places during World War II. I think it's Cambridge University Press. But about 1 million died in Vietnam. The authorities claim 2 million always, and it was almost treasonous to say less, but it seems like about 1 million, which is a huge number. It's concentrated in the north, in what used to be North Vietnam, and the proximate cause is a flooding from a very, very serious typhoon. So you do get, this is looking at the death rate, and this is looking at areas within North Vietnam. And what I want to highlight here is that there is a sense in which this is an FAD famine. Those areas in which the harvest shortfall was greatest are the areas where the death rate was highest. So this is minus. So the smaller the crop in 44, the higher the death rate. And that is because neither the French nor the Americans would allow food to be brought in from South Vietnam. And and communication lines were broken and so on. Now, how much difference that would have made is a bit controversial, but there's a very good book by this guy Marr, which concludes neither the French nor the Japanese put a high priority on saving Vietnamese lives at this time. And then this is Java, and the situation there is a bit different. The famine, in a way, is in the making before 44-45, before the end of the war. And that is because the Japanese brought in policies which prohibited people from moving food from A to B. Java had survived. It's a very densely populated, very poor place on interregional food movements. The Japanese prevented them. So you were then simply dependent on the food that grew in your area. So the worse the harvest, the worse off you're going to be. And this gives you population change in food supply. And again, this is using regional variation. So this is death rate, this is population change. But basically, they are telling you the same story, that in both cases, because of the policies occupied by the authorities, and also because the war did not let markets work as they would usually, you get deaths are highly concentrated in those areas where the harvests were poorer. Then Bengal, I'm not going to talk about here. I've written a lot about this. It's the famine I know most about, probably. But it's a war famine too, and it's paradigmatic, of course, because Amartya Sen was from Bengal, and as a kid he kind of observed the famine. He saw people moving about and so on. And then he came up with his own interpretation of famine, which argued that the issue was not poor harvests, but an issue of markets not working well, transport infrastructure, wartime conditions, and so on. So the problem was about the division of the cake rather than the size of the cake. And that mimics contemporary propaganda in Bengal by the authorities. The mantra of the authorities in Bengal at the height of the famine was sufficiency, sufficiency, sufficiency. If only the greedy were prepared to share with the hungry, there would be no problem. And of course, this suited the authorities, because then they said, we don't need to help. There's plenty of food in Bengal, if only they got their act together. Now, that was not the truth. The truth is that there was a shortage of food, and the authorities didn't act on this or try to act on it until it was too late. And by the time they did, London didn't believe them. And they said, we really need to help the Greeks first, and then the Indians maybe, because the Greeks are doing more about the war effort. And so the whole issue is, controversial and headline because of Amartya Sen's work. So my conclusion is that there was a food availability decline, but it could have been made good had the authorities recognized it and acted accordingly. But wartime priorities said different. And the result was that something like 2.1 million people died. And these are war victims. And it's we would all, I hope, agree that this was a just war. But this is a war in which these people had no interest, and it wasn't really their war. So they are, if you like, a kind of collateral damage. Now I'm going to end with something a bit different. And we know from the work of Barker and others that fetal exposure compromises adult health. And various claims have been made. Some say, it makes heart disease more likely. It makes dementia more unlikely. It makes diabetes more unlikely. It reduces life expectancy in adulthood. There are all these claims made about fetal exposure. And in the 1970s, two South African-born medics had the brilliant idea of using data from the Dutch hunger winter to test what the long-term consequences of fetal exposure might be. And they got permission from the Dutch military authorities to look at the records of people who'd been conscripted. Conscription was still operational in the Netherlands in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So they got information, and then they could compare people who were born in the famine areas and the non-famine areas. They could compare people who were born before the famine and after the famine and during the famine. And the difficulty was that these people weren't that old by the time they're looking at them in the mid-1970s. You know, these are people who are maybe in their 40s or 50s. And their focus actually is on IQ rather than on some of the other ailments I mentioned. And they concluded that, and it was something that actually kind of upset them, that the famine didn't seem to be a problem. And they're a husband and wife team, and the wife said later, she was being interviewed, and she said, a lot of our friends gave us a lot of flack for the results of our study because it looked like we were saying famine doesn't cause, and the Dutch really, you know, it wasn't a big deal. And their people, they were ex-communists, they were people on the left, so they were kind of annoyed with the result of their research. But anyway, other people then took up this in a specialist literature which was confined to the Netherlands and confined to the medical journals, really. But then in the 1990s, there's a new generation of scholars who are, I would have to say, more sophisticated, and they have a lot of funding, and that tradition has continued to the present day. And as well as that, social scientists got interested in the issue and started to work on other famines. So all of these people, the medics anyway, they're interested in the famines as natural experiments that would tell them something that would interest them as medics. But as famine specialists, we should really be interested in what does this science tell us about famines. And that is not the focus of the literature for the most part. So, of course, one thing about this literature is it's kind of neat. It's a very clever idea. And a lot of observers are taken by it. So you get Jared Diamond, for example, warning that we ignore the lessons of the hunger winter, the Dutch hunger winter, only at our children's and our grandchildren's expense. And then you get headlines in newspapers such as, World War II Dutch famine babies' brains are aging faster. Or brief famine may boost cancer risk. Or famine may make future generations fat. You know, so these kind of claims become commonplace. But I think what one has to say when you talk to medics who do this work very, very carefully, they will say that the results are still diffuse and conflicting. And that these are images, kind of familiar images from the Dutch hunger winter. And I should also say, you know, these are areas which are not affected, and then this is the heavily urbanized area, which would include Utrecht, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, these are the affected areas. So you see that the birth rate goes down a lot here and then recovers, and there's hardly anything going on in these other provinces. So it's a regional famine. The Netherlands is a small country, but we're talking about a fairly small part of a small country. There again are some disagreements about how many died. You get estimates between 15 and 25,000, that kind of number. Now, one reason why work hasn't been done on more famines than the Dutch famine. There's been some work done on Ukraine in 32, 33, 34. There's been a bit of work done on St. Petersburg during the blockade. But there isn't much take-up for famines elsewhere. And the reason is that the kind of information you need is very demanding. And you don't even have all the information you need, even for the Dutch hunger winter. For instance, this is about people being hungry, mothers being hungry, and their offspring suffering in later life. But you don't know literally how much mothers who gave birth during the famine consumed. All you have is the average. You have some sense of the average calorie intake in the area. And that isn't, that's not ideal. But there you have it. Now, I very nearly finished, 3 minutes. I'm going to talk about two ailments, two conditions on which there is agreement. And I should say, this is the beginning of what I hope is going to be a paper at some point with Lambert Lumey, who's one of the experts and a very careful student of the hunger winter. He's an epidemiologist. And also Chiwa Lee, who's a postdoc with Lumey, and who, by the way, is responsible for that step kind of diagram I showed you at the beginning. You know, I gave him the data and he had this clever idea of showing it in that way. So the two conditions that exposure makes worse, most people agree on: schizophrenia and type 2 diabetes. And I don't want to go beyond that. There are arguments about a few other conditions. But the thing then we want to ask, this is what I want to ask: how many people suffered from schizophrenia who would not have suffered from it had the Dutch hunger winter not happened? That's the issue. What difference did it make? Now, in order to be able to answer that question, you need two things. You need, well, three things actually. You need to know the number of people who were born during, so they're the people who are at risk. You need to know that. You need to know how common schizophrenia is in normal times. And then you need to know, from the results of the work by Lumey and others, how much does schizophrenia increase as a result of exposure. Those are the three things you need. Now, so you have there the number of births. This is from the classic work by Stein and Susser. And that tells you, now the other thing is, we assume a prevalence rate of 0.5%. The research shows that fecal exposure doubles the hazard. And on that basis, you get the number of extra cases is 0.5% multiplied by 12,000, which is like 65. And I don't know what the impact of that number is on you. I expected far more. It's, you know, and then we can do this for diabetes, where I'm assuming that and diabetes is unlike schizophrenia. As far as we know, the incidence of schizophrenia hasn't really changed much over time. The incidence of diabetes has, you know, it's gone up a lot. So I'm assuming 3% here. We know from the research that exposure increases the odds of type 2 diabetes by 30 to 50%. So the number of cases is like this. And that gives you between 100 and 200 cases. So the numbers are really tiny. For all the research, and from those headlines, you would expect far more. So I don't know, it's not that the research is useless. The research is very important for medical science. And it may tell us, you know, a lot about situations where there's no famine. We're just, after all, using famine as a natural experiment. But what it tells us is that these long-term impacts for famine demography are tiny. Okay, So, you know, the Dutch famine killed, like I say, 15 to 25,000 people, but it created only 65 more cases of schizophrenia, or 100 to 200 more cases of diabetes. So, and the reason is, you know, the numbers here are small because prevalence rates are fairly low, and because the Dutch famine is small. Now, you can carry out, and this is what I hope Bertie Lumey and Chiwa Lee and I do eventually, is do this for World War I and World War II. Now, I've done a few back-of-the-envelope calculations for World War II, and you're talking about the low hundreds of thousands compared to the tens of millions who die. You know, so there's a real contrast between the fetal origins impact and the vast calamities caused by, you know, long and painful deaths by famines in the way we understand famines. So to conclude then, so there, this is just at the bottom in yellow there. These are, you know, estimates for schizophrenia and type 2 diabetes. These are upper and lower bound estimates. So 286,000 as opposed to, what did we say, something like nearly 20 million dead. So bottom line then is wars made famines much more likely during the 20th century. And these famines cost more than maybe I expected, something like 30 million during. Some were deliberate and a lot were collateral damage. I mean, during war, and we see that in more recent wars, the warring parties will not go out of their way to protect civilians. If civilians get in the way of the best practice military technology, then too bad. That seems to be, sometimes public opinion has some impact on what they can do, but I think history shows during World War I and World War II, public opinion didn't really have much impact on what the warring parties did, on all sides. We also saw that relatively well-off places were not immune. That's another message of the famines. So I leave that with you. I hope there's some food for thought. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, Professor Stephen.
Thank you very much, Cormac, for very interesting, stimulating my talk as usual. I feel I'm a sufficiently good enough friend to offer a few
Absolutely.
slightly critical words, I suppose. I was a little bit surprised that the term you gave of food production in Great Britain, the conclusions that you made of it seem to forget the fact that Britain was, of course, even to import it very much a large part of the scheme. Sure. So, you know, those tables don't really make, you know, I don't think you can draw the conclusions from what you do without realising that the import is very important. Sure. Rationing, on the history of rationing, I would have thought it might be worthwhile just looking at the boats and how people had to supply themselves when they were in boats, and coming from a newly colonised land, the early stages of colonisation, both in America and in Britain, very much continued the rationing processes of the ship time activity. So you're very Eurocentric in saying that rationing wasn't known in societies until this time. If you look at it from an Australian and American point of view, where shipborne rationing was integrally important in the very early stages of colonial development in the Great World, then I think, you know, rationing will loom actually enormously large in very early stages of history. It's very interesting, the deaths in mental hospitals. Working on the Soviet Union, we tend also to be very interested in deaths in penal establishments, which actually hasn't been very much looked at. But a colleague of mine, Michał in Helsinki, and I are very, very keen to sort of work on that. And I would have thought that deaths in penal establishments during the First and Second World War would be an absolutely wonderful topic for international groups of historians to look at. And I'd very much like, you know, to promote. Given how much has been made of deaths in psychiatric hospitals, then I think deaths in penal establishments is just asking to be to develop. And I really hope that we may be able to sort of build something on that with the group that we've got here. Yes, I mean, as I'll mention tomorrow, I'm very interested in the words that I actually used to describe some of the phenomena that we have. So I think discussion of cannibalism is very interesting. In Russia, it is very clear we have two different words for cannibalism. And it does come to the point which you mentioned right at the end when we were talking about cannibalism, but in Russian we have the two words trupоедство and людоедство, which actually the two words for cannibalism are basically people eating and body eating.
Yeah.
So the body eating is when in fact, you know, as Cormac neatly said, pre-deceased subjects, where ludоедство is when you actually kill friends. So again, on a comparative nature, I think it would be very useful to see what words people are using for cannibalism, whether there is just one word. If there's two words, I would hazard a suggestion that it's probably slightly more significant in those societies that have more experience of them. But there'd be things which I think are most worthwhile looking at. But the final thing, which I was just, memory is not as good as it used to, but I did write about that, which was on the subject of innocent victims of war and famine. I remember the case I was talking to Philip about it as we came along. It may have been Alexander Macedonian's ambassador to India in one of the early connections. So 2,000 years, over 2,000 years ago, wrote back his impressions to Greece as to what he thought the differences were between the way things were going in India, which looked at that time to be absolutely, you know, wonderful, really wealthy places, to what's happening in Europe. And he basically said the main difference seems to be that when they go to war, they only kill people and not the peasants. Yeah. Maybe Europe's got something to learn from this. Anyway, that's just a suggestion from 2,000 years ago. This is a really sort of timely topic, and we don't ever appear to have learned anything.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I take all those points, and I'll tweak my text a little bit to take account of some of them, particularly on this early colonial history. I'm not sure it's strictly comparable to the kind of situations I'm talking about, but somebody else will point it out if I don't mention it. I think the idea of working on a penal institution is a really good one. I haven't done it, but there is stuff in the new book by Filzer and Goldman on that. I'm not sure they come up with numbers, but this is a book called something like Iron Fortress or something like that. It's about how the Soviets managed during World War II. It's just, I think it's just out, but I got the ebook, or I have it on Kindle.
What's it called?
It's called Iron Fortress or Fortress something. The word fortress is in the title anyway. I was aware of this distinction in Russian between the two forms of cannibalism, but I didn't want to attempt pronouncing the words. So I use them somewhere, and I think it's important. The last point you made about innocent victims it's true, and it has a resonance. There is a literature there that makes a distinction between old wars and new wars. And it's more kind of about a chronological difference than a spatial difference. And it claims that whereas in old wars the victims were mainly soldiers, in new wars civilians feel the brunt. Now I tend not to agree with that. I think civilians have always suffered during warfare, either directly or indirectly, you know.
But it's interesting that
Yeah.
this is 2,000 years ago,
Yes.
that in fact the European thought that in fact the European wars were already
Yeah.
affecting it.
But it's not strictly speaking true. I mean, Julius Caesar has been referred to as the first génocidaire, you know, in the way he treated Gaul. And there are wars between various parts of Greece where no quarter is given to civilians. You know, and
Precisely what he's saying.
Yeah.
The Greek ambassador is saying that in India everything seems so much better because the Indians aren't.
They spare civilians, right, right.
You know, it's more religious sort of taboo.
Yes.
In India about going for the civilians, whereas the Europeans don't have this.
Good.
attitude.
Okay.
So
Good.
It's precisely.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, Emily?
Yeah, thanks, Cormac, for such a wide-ranging talk. Covered so much. I think it's of interest to many of us. I was really struck how obviously you sort of ended with some of the discourse around the medical studies of the hunger winter, and you began by kind of mentioning as well the difficulty in terms of famine estimates of mortality and the wide range that they occupy. And of course, both of those two things really are cultural phenomena in terms of how they're affecting frameworks of research and ways of sort of understanding. And obviously, I suppose it's a reminder that, of course, research doesn't take place in a kind of cultural vacuum. And I just wondered if you, because you've been talking about so many of these World War I and World War II famines, if you had any reflections on the fact that many of these geopolitics are obviously still in play, which determine how and what gets studied in terms of famine. Economic historians aren't immune to this either. But I just wondered if you had any comments on that in terms of our contemporary moment, how those geopolitics will continue perhaps to structure what it is that we're looking at.
I suppose I'm not fully in my comfort zone discussing some of these things, but I do worry about where the numbers come from and to what extent you can compare one set of numbers to another. I do worry about the context in which people exaggerate and, and sometimes it's not clear. And then there are these issues, this book I'm writing is kind of quantitative history with lots of stories, but it's ultimately kind of a quantitative study. But you cannot simply add deaths together. So you have somebody that dies from bombing, you have somebody that dies in Auschwitz, you have people who die of starvation. Can you simply add them all together? You have somebody civilian dies by accident. They're very, very complicated. So it's a sensitive kind of topic. There is also the issue I hinted at, and that is, who is the civilian in these contexts? My definition is the Red Cross definition. It's people who are setting out directly to kill. And that maybe that's a narrow definition. If you are building munitions, at one remove, I suppose you're complicit. I know that's not very helpful, but these are the kind of ideas that come to mind.
Annalise?
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I'm quite new to this field, so it was very nice to have a wonderful overview. I was wondering, I had a bit more specific question about one of the graphs you showed about Warsaw. Because there it says, I think that the death rates went up from 150 to 50,000 people, I think. And I was wondering if this number also the increased population was taken into account because of the Warsaw Ghetto, because Jews were taken to the Warsaw Ghetto.
Sure. So these are death rates from TB per, and yeah, so they are, the numbers I gave there refer to cities where probably the data are better than they would be for, say, Poland as a whole. You don't have data for, and I'm assuming that the denominator is the population in the year in question, so that allowances would be made for the destruction of the ghetto and so on. But to be honest, I'm just these are numbers I found in a scientific journal, and they've been used by lots of people. So I'm assuming they're okay, but it's good to be wary. Yeah.
And perhaps regarding the psychiatric hospitals, it might be interesting to look into the work of two colleagues of mine, Evine Boegheim and Ralf Futselaar, who are doing research on psychiatric hospitals in the Netherlands.
Oh, good. I know Ralph. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. Good, excellent. Yeah. There's been some work done on psychiatric institutions in Scandinavia as well, and the claim there is that there's some excess mortality too. Yeah. Even in neutral Sweden.
That I don't know about, but in Finland, at least during the Second World War, there are some psychiatric institutions that have a higher death rate.
Yeah.
And most likely due to starvations.
Yeah. So for the most part, I don't discuss neutral countries. I made an exception for Ireland. I have a little appendix about Ireland in one case where, the war did increase mortality in a very slight way in urban areas. And that had to do, maybe it's something we don't pay enough attention to, it had to do as much with the cold as it did with the lack of food, Hopefully that's not something we're going to learn about in the coming months, but it's a real problem during the war.
Thank you. Rosetta?
Thank you for your interesting presentation. My question is regarding the long-term consequences that we talked about. I was wondering, because if I well understood, the results are not as significant. I was wondering if there is a selection effect, because usually there is a decline in birth rates during these extreme periods, and therefore newborns are usually within families that have higher living standards and probably more access to food. So I was wondering if in your data you can see the socioeconomical background of these individuals or not.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I refer to as the original sin of fetal origin studies. The births you look at are in some sense different to what births would be in normal times. And I don't know how big an issue this would be during the hunger winter. I mean, during, say, the blockade in Leningrad, it was where births dropped by about 80%. It was a very severe issue. But what I can say is that one of the reasons why you get the 65, the small number, is because births are much lower than they would be normal. But even allowing for that, you'd be talking about 100 rather than 65, And then on the issue of the selection, I'm using the findings of Bertie Lumey, who's very, very sensitive. The trouble is medical people are not sensitive to this issue for the most part. But Bertie Lumey was. He said, look, these people who are born are maybe somehow different, so we have to try and control for that. And he came up with ways of trying to see how different the social background of the people who were born was You know, and it's very difficult. And you can then make kind of say, oh, the bias is in this direction or that direction, like you are hinting. But is the bias like 20% or 30%, or is it 1,000%? I suspect it's on the lower end. You know, it may be like 20 or 30%. But you have to be aware of it. And again, that's something that you have to keep emphasizing.
That's because I work with anthropometric measures.
Yeah.
For the Chinese famine, I find an increase of the mean height.
Yes, yes, I know. And you say, why does that happen? You say, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much. First of all, impressive number of numbers. And my question is actually related to the fetal exposure. Has anyone looked into impact in very young age toddlers of the same phenomenon? And anecdotal evidence, I mean, in our family, my uncle was a very known case for that. I mean, he had diabetes because of basically the only food available was beans and he couldn't digest it.
Yes, yes, yeah. So the answer is yes, but it's a distinct literature, because the fetal origins literature, like, it's really, and here I'm repeating Bertie Lumet's work, it's really about the first trimester. It's about the damage done in the first trimester. I mean, if you're born with lower birth weight and you're very hungry afterwards, then that can have an impact. But if you're fed well, even though you're very small when you're born, you can fully recover. So a lot depends on conditions in your very early childhood and even up to your adolescence. And whether you were born during a war or before the war, that is what really matters. And there is a whole, there's a whole literature about that. And of course, some of this literature is, it's there by default. People say, well, I'd love to study the fetal origins hypothesis, but the data are lousy. So let me look at the impact on young children instead, because the data are better. You know, so there is an element of that in the research. But your question is covered, and I can give you some references.
Philip Selesky?
Chief Cormac, I remember working with Bertie maybe 10 or 11 years ago on this, and we started looking at the key point after birth when a low food seemed to have a big impact. And
Yes.
That was at the onset of puberty. And I wondered if that's something that you're looking at as well.
The answer is no, except I cite stuff in the book, but I'm not doing any research on it. I hope I end up doing something with Bertie, who's, you know, a real fantastic guy. And like, I've been interested in the fetal origins hypothesis a long time, and I followed that literature, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this was a way to get around some of the fetal research problems.
Yes.
To look at 12, 13 years old and to try and follow these people through. It was very hard to do that still.
Yeah, and the thing is, you don't know what is responsible for what they are like when they're 12 or 13.
Yeah.
Is it something that happened when they were 8 or something? Yeah, you don't know.
Yeah.
But like I say, this is an area now where social scientists, economic historians, economists are very interested in. And
I have a question, if I may. I really like what Stephen pointed out about penal establishments, prison systems, war battalions, and that kind of stuff. Because I think that the Spanish case could offer a great example of that, because it's said that around 300,000 people were in prison after the Civil War, after 1939, broadly, for 500,000, and most of them, 90% of them, were political prisoners. So they have, they were Republicans, or they had Republican sympathies or militancy. So normally, when we've studied the prison system, in the case of Spain, we have understood that it was part of the dictatorship agenda to treat these people like they treat them. But we've never taken in mind that a famine was taking place outside. And most of the deaths to be studied occurred in the first years of the post-war during the Spanish flu. So I think that's something that, of course, the historical sources give a lot of problem with this, but I think that is something that we should go for it and pay more attention. But I have one question for Cormac, and it's about, from your presentation, I got the impression that it's clear when a famine takes place during the war, but I have a problem with the post-war famines, right? There are places where there was not a famine during the war, but apparently, paradoxically, when the situation supposedly improved, when there was not a war anymore, a famine took place. I think the last Soviet famine is a very good example of that, or the case of the Spanish famine is a good example of that. There are many things to ask about this kind of famine, and I would like to know what you think about them. But do you think that in these cases, the war that antecede the famine, it should be one of the main reasons to explain the causes of these kind of famines, or not, in your experience?
I mean, one issue that this raises is when do wars start and when do wars end? And I mentioned that, 1914, 1918 isn't really appropriate for the Soviet Union, or for that matter for Greece. You could say that the Greek, for them, and indeed for the Turkish side, the war didn't end until the Treaty of Smyrna in 1922. And you could say that World War II begins for China with the rape of Nanjing in 1937. And equally, you could make this claim that, in Germany, like the last shots are obviously fired in 1918, but the impact of the war on nutrition continues until the mid-1919. So I think, we shouldn't be too rigid about when war starts and when war ends. And if there is a clear-cut case that the war is the kind of proximate cause of excess mortality, then you could say, these are deaths from war famine. So I would agree with that. And there are probably other cases where you need to look at what happened. But then there are other countries where the recovery is very, very quick, and then there is the added thing that in some parts of Europe, 1947 was a bad year for reasons that have nothing to do with the war. It was a hardship year in lots of places. Maybe not in Spain, but 47 was very bad in Britain and in Ireland. Very bad. Exactly. But I would not be dogmatic at all about. I would say you have to maybe look at some of these. Like, after all, if we're interested in the consequences in adulthood from the fetal origins, there's good case for looking at deaths in 46 or 47 or 1919.